to you or
Yeah,
the camera.
yeah. Please tell me who you are and what you're working on and why you're here today.
Yeah, today she Klee Benally2 jinne. Twitchy Shabashi chi nakudina dashinella shama a beath chi ado beath chi dashi che zithijinde nasha ado conflanish hoan. My name is Klee Benally. I'm originally from Black Mesa on the Diné or Navajo Nation. Currently I reside in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is at the base of one of our 6 holy mountains, one of our 4 cardinal mountains that represent the pillars of our universe. I am coordinator for a campaign to clean up abandoned uranium mines. There are currently more than 10,000 abandoned uranium mines located within the borders of the United States, and little is being done, if anything, in impacted communities to clean up these mines. Currently, there are no laws that require cleanup for these toxic sites, and so where I come from on the Diné Nation, there are an estimated 521 abandoned uranium mine sites, and there are mine features within that essentially make up about, I've heard, from 1 to 2,000 abandoned mine sites and features. There's never been a comprehensive inventory on all of the abandoned uranium mines throughout the U.S., but this gives a perspective of the high concentration of abandoned sites, particularly these toxic uranium sites in our traditional land use territories. There are other sites such as in the Black Hills, close to Mount Rushmore. And this is in South Dakota, Mount Rushmore being a national monument that many people recognize. There are 169 abandoned uranium mines within 40 miles of Mount Rushmore. The Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota, Dakota, various bands of indigenous nations up there. And so there are a little over 270 abandoned uranium mines in South Dakota. There are many in Wyoming, in Colorado. 15 western states have high concentrations of abandoned uranium mines. And so where I come from, my family has been impacted directly. Many of my relatives, my uncles particularly, were uranium mine workers who were never given the full education and informed of the potential health impacts, not only to themselves, but to their children. So I remember when I was a child and my uncles would come back from working in the mines in their overalls and they'd be covered in dust, and my mom refused to let them in. She was a staunch anti-nuclear activist, and so she refused to let them in and really tried to educate them about the jeopardy that toxic dust posed to their health and the health of folks in the community. So there are a range of different impacts in the Diné communities, but it's important to recognize that 75% of these more than 10,000 abandoned uranium mines are on tribal and public lands. And so this is an environmental justice issue that is directly linked to environmental racism. Many of these abandoned sites have been left open. The dust is toxic dust particles are carried for hundreds of miles. These toxic sites, when it rains or when there's seepage from runoff, it goes into the groundwater, contaminates surface water, small streams, other types of watersheds are contaminated because of these, in many cases, open pit sites. So in many cases, 60 years or so is how long these sites have been left abandoned. In communities like Cameron, which is a little ways north, I have some relatives there. One of my relatives has her house, there's no running water, no electricity. The transmission power lines actually from Navajo Generating Station, which is a coal-fired power plant near Page, Arizona, runs right past her house. And this, in the community where she's at, she can't drink the water from there because it's contaminated due to uranium mining and that toxic legacy. And so this is, the EPA has closed or identified more than 22 wells that have high levels of radioactivity. So they've closed those wells, and that impacts more than 54,000 people who rely upon these wells for their livestock and for their sole sources of drinking water. So my relatives in these areas have to drive to so-called border towns, to the reservations, to haul water. And this is something that they continue to face to this day. There are other sites in South Dakota, particularly one known as Riley Pass, which is in the Cave Hills, a sacred area to Lakota people. And I went to this area accompanied with other folks who are part of the Clean Up the Mines campaign from the Defenders of the Black Hills. And one of this toxic site at Riley Pass, this abandoned uranium mine, which has actually received a little bit of cleanup, the overburden was just sort of pushed over the waste rock over the sacred place. And there's an offering site right below that overburden area that's completely contaminated. So to go pray there, to actually go make offerings, they have to wear masks. There was a sign actually in this area at Riley Pass that said no one, and this is public lands, this is on Custer National Forest, that no one should be in this area for more than 24 hours out of a whole year due to high levels of radioactivity. And so this is a sacred place where they do offerings, where they pray, but they can't, due to the threat of the toxic exposure, they can't be there for more than 24 hours. This actually was adjacent to another horrific site, which is Ludlow School. There's an elementary school in Ludlow, South Dakota. It's a very small town, but directly, it's about 200 meters or so about 200 meters from the school is a private abandoned uranium mine. We took a Geiger counter with a group of folks from Clean Up the Mines and Defenders of the Black Hills into the playground of this school, and we got readings that were 4 times the allowable safe return limit for folks going back to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster crisis point. And so this is America's secret Fukushima. This is something that children are being exposed to every day, and there's little education, and there's nothing being done to protect their health. And this is a national catastrophe, really. There are a range of other impacts, on the Diné Nation. Their homes, the legacy of toxic uranium mining and the abandoned mines is that some of the waste ore or rocks, material from these abandoned sites were used to build homes. I mean, uranium contaminated or radioactive dust or rock looks like any other dust or rock. You can't tell the difference. Its radiation is an invisible threat, or radioactivity on that level is an invisible threat. And so people have built homes out of this material. There are areas where there is little protection for livestock to prevent them from going into these contaminated areas, or children from playing, or communities and so forth. So education is a very challenging issue, and cleanup is a very significant barrier. As I mentioned, these corporations completely irresponsible and exploited this 1872 mining law, which essentially allows them or doesn't require cleanup or reclamation of these sites. So many of them just walk away, and negligent government agencies really never held them accountable. And so this is our campaign right now, is to clean up these mines, because it's way past time.
Wow. So what about health issues? Are you seeing cancer in your communities that maybe wasn't there before, or?
Currently there are studies that are being done, and Leona Morgan from Diné Nukes can talk a little bit more about her experience with that. There have never been conclusive health studies specifically looking at the population of Diné or other tribal populations. And this is a very serious issue, because this is a 60-year legacy. There have been limited studies done on mine workers' health and exposure, but in the case of the general public, this is a very serious threat. I mean, we know, You know, we see the health impacts because we see the deformities, we see the birth defects, we see the high rates of cancers, and there's a direct correlation that we can see with the contaminated communities, contaminated water, the waste in these areas, and high levels of exposure. But because there's no conclusive studies, you know, we can't draw that link completely. But the nuclear industry is completely responsible for those health impacts. There is very clear evidence that there's no safe dose of radioactivity, and this is the legacy that we continue to face.
Right. So have you seen, seems like there's a younger generation of activists rising up right now. I know from talking to Leona a bit about that it seems to be a new wave that's happening, or are you seeing that?
Depends on how much time we have here.
Yeah.
I've been organizing for years on different issues, particularly sacred sites. You have to understand, wherever there's an environmental crisis, there's a cultural crisis, because we are people of the earth. And really, it's a social crisis. You know, our culture or our spirituality is directly connected to nature. There's no dichotomy between spirit and nature for Dene or Navajo people. It's one and the same. So our existence is directly tied to Mother Earth through our ceremonies, through our prayers, and physically through our direct connection to sacred places. And many of these sacred places are under threat, like Mount Taylor, which the disruption, the desecration of a site like that has direct implications on a social level, a cultural level, for our psyches and our spiritual being. It's a direct threat to our cultural survival, and it's a threat of cultural genocide.
Thank you. That's fantastic. That's really, really fantastic. I'm going to stop.
Oh, I didn't answer your question about young people, but
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
There's been recent resurgences of indigenous activism or advocacy and uprising. Particularly, I think there was a hot sort of flash moment relating to Idle No More that was initiated out of so-called Canada, where indigenous communities were rising up against anti-indigenous legislation there in attempts at land grabs.
Just close with your statement about Idle No More and the resurgence.
So Idle No More was initiated out of so-called Canada in a response to anti-indigenous legislation, which amounted to a land grab. And so the actions that were called by 4 indigenous women from that area were echoed through other indigenous nations of folks coming together to hear that message and to demonstrate resilience. And that message has, reached across borders. I mean, because these are colonial borders between, so-called Canada, so-called U.S., and so-called Mexico, and so-called U.S. on that level as well. And there is a bit of a